just wanted to say, I don't need to introduce Steve, you all know him, but I wanted to make sure that you understood that there won't be 3 Sunday school classes, as it seems to indicate in the bulletin. That is 2 weeks, or a week from, no, 2 weeks from today. So then we have the Banning Book Sunday school with 2 members of our congregation. So next week you can come, and it will be Solomon this time.
Oh, okay, good. I talked to Mark and Deb, and they were kind of nervous, thinking they were on next week. So you have me next week.
I have both mics on, Steve.
Okay.
The closer you get to this one, the better off we'll be.
All right.
Okay, thank you so much.
I'll try and do what I can. Let's just to back up a bit. We started on David, which I didn't really expect to get to last week, but we did. I told you it was hard to get an accurate picture of David because of the way he evolved from a sort of a flesh and blood person to almost a symbol of a spotless holy king by the time you get to the writing of the chroniclers. Now, then Saul came to a sad end. The crown prince Jonathan fell with his father and 2 of his brothers at Mount Gilboa to the Philistines. The next son in line was Ishmael, Saul's son Ishmael, who sees himself as the king presumptive and begins to assume the throne and set up court at Mahanaim, which you see in Transjordan on the map. I don't know why I'm pointing back there. But David had fled some years before that, fled from Judah. It wasn't even safe for him to remain in his own tribal area because of Saul's jealous wrath that pursued him everywhere he went. And when he got there, he allied himself to the Philistine ruler. It says king, I believe. The Hebrew word melech just sort of means a leader, a head person of a city. It's not like necessarily a king of a whole nation. But he allied himself to one Achish of Gath. Gath, you remember, is where Goliath hailed from. And became a mercenary for Achish of Gath. And Achish established David and his 600 retainers that he had by now gained at Ziklag, which is down in the south, about as far south as you get on that map there. From there, David operated, keeping those Amalekites and other troublesome people in check for the Philistines. Upon Saul's death, though, David moves back to Judah and is anointed there by the elders of Judah, whom he had courted their favor for some time at Hebron, all the while feigning loyalty to the Philistines, who still consider him their loyal vassal. David manages that kind of subterfuge all the time. He's also plotting and campaigning and dropping broad hints to have the northern tribes, the ones currently under Ishmael, to go over to his side, that they might join in recognizing him king as well as the Judahites. And what follows then is this long conflict between David and Ishmael. I don't know how long that went on. David began reigning at Hebron when he was about 30 years old. He slew Goliath and joined in Saul's court in his late teens, we assume. The chronology is very difficult to get at. The chronological articles that I read on it vary about 15 years in the scale of things. In this conflict, Joab, David's nephew, is his military commander, but more than that, he's also the key advisor to David, as is Abner, the first cousin of Saul. So they make him first cousin once removed of Ishmael, is Ishmael's military commander and his advisor as well, and really the strong personality that sort of manipulates Ishmael. There emerges a blood feud between Joab and Abner that gets very personal Abner's forces killed Joab's brother in battle, and that may be the source of that hostility. But Joab especially feels the hostility toward Abner more so than the other way around. Well, eventually there's a falling out between Abner and Ishmael. Abner sort of makes a play for the throne there by taking one of Saul's concubines, and that grows so bitter that Abner just sort of betrays Ishmael and starts plotting with Saul to have the northern tribes come down and switch over to his side. And it's during these delicate negotiations, eventually Abner makes the pilgrimage down to see David at Hebron. But when he comes down there, probably under agreement of safe conduct, Joab murders him. And that really is a threat to the negotiations that are going on. So David at that point throws an elaborate funeral for Abner in a funeral procession, and he appears himself as the chief mourner in the whole thing. Well, at this point, David's ascension to the throne of Saul becomes almost inevitable. The only remaining question for Ishmael's supporters is how to switch sides as easily as possible with as much profit as possible. Accordingly, 2 captains of Saul's commandos murdered Ishmael in his bed and then trot off to David expecting to be handsomely rewarded, but instead of that, his gratitude, they were put to death. You see, David never wavered in his public respect for Saul, and that extended also to Saul's descendants. He went to great lengths to protect respect for the office that he hoped to make secure for himself. And now, with no serious rivals to contend with, the elders of Israel came to Hebron and recognizes David's sovereignty, and David reigned, says the text, over all Israel and over Judah. Now, that curious phrase from 2 Samuel 5 indicates the deep divisions between north and south inherited by David. But he moved swiftly to solidify his newly won dominion. First requirement, a new capital. Hebron, located, as you see, in the middle of Judah, that's about halfway down in the Dead Sea and to the west, was too far from the northern half of the kingdom now, and was squarely a Judahite city. So that didn't pass political muster. For various reasons, Gibeah, Saul's former capital, Gilgal, the ancient site of the Hebrew shrine, and several others along the way, possible sites, had serious drawbacks. The two being they were too far from one side or the other, and they weren't naturally defensible. They didn't have natural defenses to them. David had skillfully played on the natural divisions between north and south in order to gain his throne. Now, that was a stratagem full of terrible prospects for the future of a united kingdom, and immediately confronted him with the need to heal the breach that he had so skillfully exploited. Therefore, the choice of a new capital was of premium importance. Fortunately, there was a perfect solution to be had. Jebus, Jerusalem, had been a Jebusite fortress for centuries. Early Hebrew attempts to capture it had failed, to wit, Joshua 15 tells us that. And even during the reign of Saul, it sat unchallenged, only 3 miles from Saul's capital at Gibeah. On the border between northern and southern tribes, without historical connection to either, it could not but attract David's attention. Moreover, it was a formidable stronghold in the high mountains, and it would provide a warrior king with the defense he was sure to need. How many of you have ever been to Jerusalem? Several of you, and you know that that is quite imposing, sitting up there in the hill if you're down in the Kidron Valley, or even back over the Mount of Olives on the east side. It is a formidable stronghold. So David and his retainers moved against the Jebusites. The inhabitants of the city mounted the ramparts, and they stood there taunting David and his men, claiming that the blind and the lame could defend this site. They'd never get inside. They could easily defend such a natural stronghold, but David found the weakness of the city in the city's defense system to be the water shaft going from the natural spring in the Kidron Valley and the brook of Kidron. Along with along with the rain collecting cisterns, provided the water supply for the citizens of the city. Now, subsequent history, there were several other water shafts built, most prominently the one by Hezekiah and his engineers and sappers. I've been in that water shaft. So while David and the majority assaulted the walls and distracted the defenders up there, Joab and a select few men entered secretly through the water shaft, opened the city to the attackers, and together they generally slaughtered the Jebusites. And David reigned over Judah at Hebron for 7 years. During those 7 years, he had 6 sons born to him. He had 7 wives. I don't read of any concubines. Only one daughter is named, Tamar. And during most of that time, he's still feigning loyalty to the Philistines. And it's too late that the Philistines become aware of David's power and his even greater potential for the future. Hoping to repeat their former victories against the Hebrews, they moved to the highlands now again with the intention of breaking David in his new stronghold. Now, the record of that is a little confusing, but it appears that for a short time the Philistines occupied Bethlehem, which is only 6 miles, is it on the map? It's not on the map, 6 miles to the south of Jerusalem. But their attempts to move against Jerusalem itself were repulsed in the valley of Rephaim on the west side of the city, the southwest, really. And David scattered them again in the same valley when they repeated their attempt, and he drove them as far as Gezer, directly west of Jerusalem. And though not ending Israel's trouble with the Philistines, it did put the brake on their designs to to dominate all of Canaan. So, with Jerusalem secured and the Philistines on the defensive, David struck another masterful blow in his efforts to unite these people. Amid scenes of wild excitement, the Ark of the Covenant, the ancient symbol of God's presence with his people, was brought to the new capital. I talked about that last year in this class, and about Uzzah and his being struck dead as he reached out to steady the ark when it threatened to tip off the ox cart. Of all the moves of the wily David, this one, compounded of his deep religious faith and his political savvy, this was the shrewdest. In one fell swoop, he made Jerusalem, the city of David, the holiest site in Israel, and sought to weave the Hebrew tribal loyalties into the fabric of his kingdom. Still, not all of David's political moves proved as effective in forging unity. To overcome that all Israel and Judah dynamic, north and south, he abandoned Saul's 6-region system of administration and tried to revive the older tribal structure from the early days of settlement in Canaan. This system, involving 12 units rather than 6, should have offered him the opportunity to circumvent the natural rivalry between the 2 tribal alliances of North and South, Israel and Judah, which had grown out of Saul's governance. Now, in addition to bringing the ark to Jerusalem, David had one more thing to do. David brought Abiathar the legitimate high priest from the shrine at Shiloh up to the north, which was in Philistine hands for some time, but now back in theirs, he brought Abiathar to Jerusalem and made him a court official and head of the Jerusalem cult. In so doing, David successfully brought religion and politics together and indelibly stamped a divine nationalism on the religion of Israel. The result, of course, was that the lines between the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of God became blurred. And I submit to you, and I'm reluctant with a church historian here to step out on this limb, but just about every regime since has tried something like that, except maybe the regimes who wanted to get rid of religion altogether. But either from the top down by the rulers or some people to the rulers tried to meld together religion and politics and get a nationalistic flavor to the religion. We saw it in Adolf Hitler tried to subjugate the church to the Nazi Party. And we've seen some strange things in the 70s and 80s in this country. I probably shouldn't go there. But in time, this militant nationalism degraded the basic themes of covenant and judgment. But this change in direction of religion's development is perhaps more than any other the reason why David is remembered and venerated. David's failure was administrative. The old structure, 12 tribal structure, was not viable. It became a system which too much depended on one man, while at the same time left considerable potential power in the hands of tribal elders. And that's something else we've seen. Think Afghanistan and our attempts to have a strong central government with a tribal system so strong yet. In spite of all of David's efforts, all Israel, meaning Saul's old 5-region northern alliance, was ready to align itself against Judah, with some defection on the part of the tribe of Benjamin, which later we'd see. And of course, this is exactly what happened after the death of Solomon. Still, the 12 tribes system continued in the organization of the temple, but in terms of political effect, it never really succeeded for David or for Solomon. Yet in moments of his early successes, and for some time to come, whatever doubts there were about David were erased by his defeat of the Philistines. He lifted the threat that hung so heavily over the Hebrews and reduced the Philistines to such a state that they never again were a major factor in military or political affairs. Now, that wasn't the last skirmish with the Philistines. You read 2 Samuel 21, you read about another one with Goliath's kinsmen, giants again, in a battle. But, of course, the Hebrews came out on top of that situation. And one by one, the Ammonites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Moabites, and various peoples of the southern desert like the Amalekites fell before the warrior king and were added to his dominion. The Canaanite cities of the plains were more or less assimilated. But then again, the Canaanites never were much of a military force against the Hebrews, but a tremendous cultural force, which continued to infect the kingdoms of Israel and Judah until their exile, till the overthrow of Samaria and Jerusalem. But they were more or less assimilated into the regime, into the dominion of Israel. Most surprising, he defeated the Arameans in northern Transjordan and annexed Damascus. Now, Damascus isn't even on your map, it's so far north, up to the north and northeast. a long way up there, past Dan and the Golan Heights and so on, and held sway as far north as the Euphrates, that in far northern, what is now Syria, David's dominion stretch. The Phoenicians, you see them up, way up the top of the Proscenium Arch here, or the arch there. It starts to say the word Phoenicia. Oh, it is on your map, Phoenicia. They became David's friends. And you know, the two cities, Phoenician cities, primary cities of Tyre and Sidon, that Hiram of Tyre became especially a good friend, did a lot of business. But they also turned their attention west and began their greatest period of maritime activity. They were the sailors, they were the merchant marine of the area. Now, with this extension of territory came enormous economic advantages, not the least of which was the control of both the eastern and western trade routes. You see on your map the Way of the Sea and the King's Highway. For centuries, the camel caravans had moved along these ancient trade routes. And David's conquest of Edom, down to the south and southeast there, left him in control of large deposits of copper and iron, later to become the famous King Solomon's mines. And that went all the way to the Gulf of Aqaba, almost. And David may have begun fortification of the city, of the country, but there is slim evidence of it in archaeological work. Solomon was really the one to undertake that with great zeal. Under David, Israel remained pretty much what it had been, principally an agricultural and pastoral state. Now, the last years of David's long reign saw the beginning of inevitable change. Ready availability of slaves and vast amounts of money from new sources were certain to make a difference in the standard of living. But the zenith of this prosperity was to come later with Solomon's exploitation of the resources provided by his father. But the country prospered, and David grew old. And when they say old, that's a relative term. David was younger than I am when he died. Like Caesar Augustus, he lived too long, and his latter days were full of sadness, occasioned mostly by his children. His early failures as a father came back to haunt him with a vengeance. He was permissive. He looked the other way at times. Relative weakness in the superpowers of Egypt to the southwest, and Mesopotamia to the north and northeast, combined with the subjugation of these ancient foes surrounding the Hebrew people, allowed Israel freedom from wars in the latter years of David's reign. Internally, however, the kingdom was shaken by intrigue and even open revolt under Absalom, in which the royal princes had no small part, Absalom especially. Yet in the end, David lived to see a strong son secure on the throne with him as co-regent for a time. The shepherd from Bethlehem had reunited the kingdom, secured it, expanded it, endowed it, and passed it on to able hands. Now, that's a fairly quick run at David. I'm ready to entertain questions at this time or discussion. Not that I have all the answers, but anybody want to discuss anything, they're welcome to do that. I have in my hand here two examples of a timeline of David's life that show that 15-year discrepancy in the events. David had 7 wives while he lived in Hebron. As I said, 6 sons were born to him. In Jerusalem, he acquired Bathsheba. 4 sons were born of her, less the one that died in infancy or stillborn almost. While in Jerusalem, his 8th wife, Bathsheba, gave him 4 sons. Other wives, who remain unnamed, gave birth to 9 more sons. A total of 19 sons are named in the biblical record. Then in 1 Chronicles 3:9, we find all these were sons of David besides the sons of the concubines, and Tamar was their sister. That only one female is named in the whole bunch. And then it says in 2 Samuel 5 and in 1 Chronicles 14 reveal that David took other wives and other concubines, but we're not given a real number. But he took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. Now, and then I have the names of a lot of them here. But anyway, he was quite prolific in that way. His son was to outdo him, but just interesting asides. If you comb through the record real carefully, you find all kinds of interesting things. So, what questions might you have? I see Harvey has one.
I find it interesting that Bathsheba, the foreigner, was the mother of the successor of David.
Yeah. David's son Adonijah found that interesting too. There rose almost a civil war between the 2 sons. Now Bathsheba, and interesting, she conspired with Nathan the prophet, and that is a strange alliance. Nathan and Bathsheba, if you remember Nathan's role in really condemning David's action with Bathsheba, they kind of prodded him to appoint Solomon as co-regent. David is still alive and has Solomon crowned as co-regent with him. Yeah. Adonijah was the presumptive prince left. Absalom was, 2 of the sons were dead, the first and third, and I think Adonijah may have been the second son. Absalom was the third. The name of Amnon? Amnon, I think, is the firstborn, the one who rapes his sister and is murdered by his half-sister, and who is Absalom's full sister, and Absalom murders that firstborn son. And we all know how Absalom died, and after leading what looked like was going to be a successful rebellion against David. He was winning by politics and lavishing favors upon people, was winning the loyalty of practically the whole of Jerusalem. And David had to flee, full of anguish and tears, in the city. For some time he was gone. I think, if memory serves, like 2 years that David was in exile from Jerusalem. Yeah. What else do we have here? Oh, Peg, right here. Right here.
Well, one of the takeaways is things don't change a whole lot, do they? The details, maybe, but not the essence of the wars and the intrigue and so on. But I had never heard anything about David's alliance with the Philistines. I would have thought that he would have been distanced from them. Can you talk some more about how he became more affiliated with the Philistines in defense?
With the Philistines. Well, David went various places in his exile, at first when he was exiled from Saul. And I don't know, we're really not told, except the 1 Samuel says he came to Achish. That's all it says. He came to Achish of Gath. He was given interesting detail in there when David visits the high priest, or the priest, was it Abiathar at that time, or Ahimelech, Abiathar's father, I believe. And he gives David the sword of Goliath. So you almost get the sense that David's carrying Goliath's sword into Gath, or the regions that are under Gath's control, and allies himself with Achish. But the record really doesn't say just what kind of maneuvering took place. It's just that David somehow had gained these 600 retainers, 1 Samuel reports, that become his chosen troops, his small mercenary army during that time. And well, I think I said last week that Achish really establishes him at Ziklag, which is in the far south, so he can deal with the Amalekites and others there. And of course, whoever are in the Judahites were supposed to be among his victims as well, but he's really ingratiating himself with those folks, his own people. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have a more accurate answer, but there just isn't one available to us.
A comment about his wives or concubines. I think toward the end of his life, he had a woman in bed to keep him warm, right?
I'm getting an echo and not hearing.
Okay, maybe this is better. I think at the end of his life, he had a concubine or wife who was there to keep him warm.
Yeah,
Okay.
at the end, oh yes, Abishag was her name. As they felt the old king was on his last legs, literally, they brought a young concubine to him. And it says he knew her not, you know. He didn't rise to the occasion, apparently. But it's amazing what people can trick their youth into doing. And they brought him Abishag.
Another comment, Hardy Brown and I share a biblical archaeology magazine, and it is astounding how many ruins of fortified cities are in this region. So it was a very unsafe, unsure environment for everybody.
Yeah, we will talk about that when we get to Solomon. But Solomon had what we call chariot cities, they call them, and his stables have been discovered by archaeologists. These massive stables that he had for his cavalry. He established a fortress city in what is now Palmyra, Syria. I forget the biblical name of it, but it's way, way, way far north of Damascus, and held that city after Damascus had been retaken by the Arameans. Solomon then fortified that city north of the Arameans, north of Damascus by a long shot. Interesting, but yeah, and David, we just have slim. We know, archaeology knows how much David expanded the city walls of Jebus, of Jerusalem. The city grew to a much larger size under David than it had been under the Jebusites. And then, of course, it had many subsequent expansions since, to the point that Gibeah, Saul's fortress, is really in Jerusalem today. It's part of the city. That is about the best of archaeology we have. We don't have really, if he did establish any fortifications, we don't have record of them. David did. Most of what we know about David was, archaeologically speaking, is from Jerusalem. Anything else anyone has? We got some time. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. And Solomon here, we won't have anything next week. Oh, I'm fading. Yeah. I said if I get into Solomon. We may not have anything next week, but nevertheless, we could begin a little bit on Solomon. Solomon's magnificence, heralded in its own day already, has subsequently become fabled. A master builder, the likes of whom the region had not seen until Herod the Great. He not only glorified Jerusalem, but erected massive structures throughout the land. Trade routes by land and by sea under Solomon enriched his treasury and introduced luxury items on a wide scale. This grand monarch, cosmopolitan, eclectic, urbane, brought Israel to the pinnacle of its glory as an international power and economic force, and perhaps, maybe certainly, also in self-indulgence. Solomon basked in splendor unprecedented in his nation, but the costs were enormous, and his vast and varied sources of income ultimately could not keep pace with his expenditures. And that was one of the things that led to the undoing of the United Kingdom. His administrative structure emphasized the tribal antagonisms exploited by his father. His religious practices and views caused him to be remembered as the one who sacrificed at the high places. These are these Canaanite places throughout the country, which archaeologists found several of them. And he introduced a host of foreign gods into Jerusalem. At his death, internal discord combined with the resurgent strength of those external foes surrounding him caused to bring down his throne and return his dominions to their former status as petty states. Now, Solomon's claim to the throne, as you've already made a hint at, was tenuous. First, there was no dynastic principle in Israel at the time. Saul's son had not succeeded in claiming his father's throne. Solomon was not the oldest son of David. Of the 6 sons born to David in Hebron, the first and third, Amnon and Absalom, we've said, are already dead. The fate of the others is not known. Solomon's a second son of David and Bathsheba. The first one died in infancy, as we said. So he ranked way down the list of the princes, with the title to the throne clouded both by the lack of tradition and the absence of a crown prince. A fratricidal struggle, at the very least, was in prospect when the time came for the aging David to sleep with his fathers. No one was more keenly aware of this than David himself. So as David tottered toward death, his oldest living son, that's Adonijah, prepared to inherit the throne. He went just south of Jerusalem to Enrogel, which is not on your map, where he more or less held court. But David, under the urging of Nathan and Bathsheba, that strange alliance, moved to forestall a power struggle after his death. He named Solomon as co-regent and caused him to be anointed as king in Jerusalem, and by so doing perhaps delayed the eventual breakup of the kingdom and for the moment, and prevented further fratricidal struggle within the royal family. So, for better or for worse, that was probably the wise thing. Things could have been much worse much earlier if David had not done that. But upon David's death, Solomon, motivated by his mother, eventually killed his half-brother Adonijah. There was a sort of a covenant beforehand that this wouldn't happen. And I forget just what the conditions were, but something went afoul and ended up dispatching someone to murder Adonijah. So we know that at least a third of the Davidic princes fell in family struggles. And with Adonijah also fell many of those who had been faithful to David, including the ever loyal Joab. Established in unquestioned power, Solomon set about to solidify the kingdom and to exploit its resources. Now, there was at this time some shrinkage of Israelite territory, perhaps somewhat deliberately on Solomon's part, largely because it was ungovernable, all this territory. So the territory did shrink. It wasn't as big a footprint as it was in David's day. In influence, it became a much bigger footprint. In the north, the Syrians rose up. I said the Arameans, we called them before. You remember Abraham was an Aramean. My father was a wandering Aramean, goes to Creed. The Syrians rose up and they established a king at Damascus. Solomon moved to fortify his newly established city at Tadmor, that's the one, where modern Palmyra, approximately 125 miles northeast of Damascus. Now, 125 miles is huge on that map. As I said, from Dan to Beersheba, from the Jordan to the sea, and a little beyond the Jordan, is about the size of the state of Vermont, the whole biblical arena of what I'd usually identify as Israel. So 125 miles northeast, leapfrogging over this new Syrian king to establish and fortify a city there. Damascus continued to harass Israel throughout the time of the divided monarchy and was always a force to be reckoned with. You can read all about that in 1st, 2nd Kings. About the same time, the Edomites down to the south, backed by Egypt, revolted. And Solomon ended up losing almost the entire territory south of the Dead Sea, with the exception of the valuable mines in the Gulf of Aqaba. Now, you know, the Gulf of Aqaba, where the Red Sea comes through, and at the north, there's two gulfs, narrow gulfs. The eastern one is at the tip of it is the Gulf of Aqaba. And Solomon built massive fortifications there is an indication of how precarious his hold on the area was. They had to sleep with their swords to keep this area intact. This was not the end of Solomon's troubles with the Egyptians. They seized Gezer off to the west of Jerusalem and burned it and then gave it back to Solomon. Why? Because Solomon married an Egyptian princess. That was the first recorded marriage we have of Solomon is with an Egyptian princess. Solomon rebuilt and fortified Gezer. But his Egyptian campaign in Philistia indicates a reestablishment of that Egyptian authority and influence in the area after a hiatus of almost 200 years that Egypt had not been such a dynamic factor. One Jeroboam, a man of outstanding engineering ability, was a valued figure in Solomon's service. But when he was singled out by certain religionists from the north as a man who could lead the northern tribes in revolt, Jeroboam had to flee and found refuge and encouragement at the court of Egypt until the time was ripe for him. I'm trying to decide how far I should go with this before I run completely out of thunder for next week. Okay, let's do this. The kingdom was diminished in size, and then I'll throw it open again. But with Solomon's fortifications in strategic places and watchfully secure, it remained so throughout his life. In spite of, or perhaps because of the loss of land, Israelite holdings remained an empire of considerable size. Holdings, not necessarily real estate, but holdings of considerable size, strength, and potential wealth. The fares exacted from these camel caravans along the King's Highway and the Way of the Sea proved especially lucrative. He's really seriously cashing in. People on caravan routes, it's not quite like toll booths. They're more tax for the cargo they bring, depending on what they're carrying. That's how the fares are arranged. And so Solomon's getting fat off those two routes. I'm going to, one more thing, and then I'm stopped. You add to that Solomon's establishment of a merchant marine fleet at Ezon-Geber, that's at the Gulf of Aqaba, and eventually traded along the Red Sea to Egypt and Cush, say Ethiopia, or Ophir, say Somaliland, and even included forages to the interior of Africa. Ships of Tarshish were provided by David's old friend, King Hiram of Tyre, and maybe even the sailors, or the bulk of them, because the Hebrews were not seafaring people. If you read the 107th Psalm, it's the Gentiles. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. These saw the hand of the Lord and his mighty works in the deep, and they got into trouble. Hebrews didn't do that, except maybe the Danites were somewhat known for being at sea. But these ships of Tarshish, and they call it Tarshish because that's what the Iberian area was called when Jonah got a ship to Tarshish. It was a long-haul ship, supposedly, that Jonah would have taken. But they plied the whole Mediterranean Sea, the Phoenicians, all along the European coast, all the way out there to probably the Azores, and then the north coast of Africa, and then down the Red Sea to the west coast of Africa. I don't know if they made it to the Indian Ocean, but they traded inland at these places. And it says that as commercial interests spread by sea, by land and by sea, grain, oil, wine, copper, and even armaments were procured and then resold to the Hittites and the Syrians. The Syrians are a potential enemy. Solomon becomes an arms trader. And it seems a rather precarious business to be in when you're selling arms to your enemies or potential enemies. Let's stop there and take any residual questions. We got about 5-7 minutes left, don't we? Yeah, David. David is here among us.
Steve, help me a little bit understanding the transition from David to Solomon. This business of being a co-regent, and then I hear the stories of all that Solomon did. There must have been kind of an overlap kind of a thing and how power was shared. Do you have any perspective on that?
We're not really given anything on that when Solomon's all his building, and especially the temple that Solomon eventually built, that David was denied to build, are told later in the story. We're not told much of that time of co-regency or how long it lasted. Estimated, and I don't know where they get the estimates from, but in articles I've read, a couple of years. David is considered a really old, over-the-hill man. He died at, most people say, age 70. And he's this doddering old man. at age 70. That's a scary thought. Yeah, but his projects and stuff were not later. It came later, at least in the biblical record. They come later. We first have the stories of the intrigue and the killing of Adonijah and stuff like that come first. I mentioned that David was denied the temple. You know that David wanted to build a house for the Lord, but the prophet Nathan received word that David was not to do that. David was a warrior. He was a man of blood, and therefore was denied to build a temple for the Lord, a permanent house. Solomon, comparatively, was a man of peace, although Solomon, you'll see, raised a massive army, had military forces that David could only dream about. David could never, he was frustrated in his desire to build a temple. He built a pretty nice house for himself. Of course, Solomon built a nicer one.
It's interesting, in art, the two sort of iconic images of David are, of course, with Goliath, the young man who achieves great things, but also as a musician playing the harp.
Yeah.
Those two images, nothing about his warfare or his scoundrelous behavior at times.
The chronology we have, you know, that we guesstimate, David was probably about 18 years old when he moved from feeding the flocks, was bringing his older brothers who were soldiers in Saul's army. He was bringing them lunch, something, provisions, and this business. And Goliath was in the valley of Elah taunting the Hebrew forces, and he couldn't understand why they let this uncircumcised Philistine, you know, mock them. And David slew him, probably, you know, according to those who try and figure out the chronology, about 18 years old. And a couple of things happened. He got absorbed into Saul's court. He became a courtesan, and a member of the court, and a musician that played for Saul, because Saul had an evil spirit or a troubled spirit, you know, and it was soothing to him. And David also became a warrior, and then one of Saul's commanders, to the point that, you know, that they compared him. Saul has slain his 1,000, David has slain his 10,000s. They said he's a hyperbole. I remember when I was in grad school at Swift Hall at the University of Chicago, we had two pictures of David, massive oils. One of them was David holding Goliath's head, which was a huge head. It was about half the size of David's body. And the other one is these girls with tambourines singing and dancing and singing David's praise as this returning warrior came home from the battle, having slain his 10,000s. And David was probably, we estimate, age 30 when he was anointed king at Hebron. And he reigned there for 7 years at Hebron, then 33 years in Jerusalem, and died at age 70. An educated guesstimate. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Steve, and we look forward to next week to
Yeah,
hear more about Saul.
I'll try and
Thank
come
you.
up with some other stuff because I'm running out here. Okay.
Okay, thanks very much.
Yeah, sure. No, thank you.